Well, welcome to the second of this series of webinars entitled Defending Human Rights in China, the Way Forward. We have 3 consecutive panels scheduled for the next 2 hours with 8 very distinguished speakers and 3 periods for you, the viewers, to ask questions, which you can pose on the YouTube chat box. The first panel is on the topic of what happened with China human rights in 2020 and the current state of affairs. Then we'll go to panel 2, defending human rights. And finally, panel 3, how governments can hold China to account for China's gross violations of the norms of the international rules-based order and the way ahead for democratic nations' engagement of the PRC regime. So there will be 3 periods of question and answers for you, the viewers, to ask questions. As I said, you can post them in the YouTube live chat box on the YouTube watch page. And I'd certainly encourage everybody to get their questions for the panelists in, and I'll try and get to as many of them as the time allows. This event is sponsored by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Optimum Publishing International, Hong Kong Watch, the China Democracy Foundation, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, and last but certainly not least, the European Values Center for Security Policy. I am Charles Burton. I'm a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and at the European Values Center. First of all, to start off, I'd like to introduce my co-chair for these Way Forward conferences, the CEO of Optimum Publishing International and the chair of the China Democracy Foundation, my dear friend and collaborator, Dean Baxendale, to say a few words of welcome. Dean?
Thank you, Charles. In September of last year, we launched the Way Forward series, Hong Kong, How the Free World Responds to China's Crackdown. We had an outstanding group of speakers, including Ben Rogers, Miles Yu, Nathan Law, and Marieke Olberg. The conference received global press from Toronto to London and from Washington to Beijing. In an article that I co-wrote with Ben Rogers, we spoke of Canada's unique role as a leader within the global community of nations, as an advocate for gender, LGBTQ, civil, human, and religious rights worldwide. But for many years, Canada and our supposed allies with shared values seem to have been sizing up the devil's bargain, diplomatically trading off the economic and commerce opportunities with Beijing for our silence on well-documented systemic abuse of ethnic and religious minorities within China's own borders, as well as the suppression of free speech and civil liberties. But these problems are not new, and in fact date back to the formation of the PRC in 1949 and their treatment of the peoples of Tibet. How did we get here? When the People's Republic of China replaced the Republic of China at the United Nations in 1971, Beijing reaffirmed its acceptance of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UNDHR. China subsequently signed on to all manner of conventions, including ones that call for the elimination of racial discrimination, prohibit torture and cruel punishment, enshrine minority rights to culture and social practices, establish civil and political rights, and more. However, despite China's status as a signatory on these conventions and its supposed acceptance of the UN's rights doctrine, the Chinese Communist Party has established itself as amongst the worst human rights violators in the world. As authors Marieke Olberg and Clive Hamilton point out in Hidden Hand, Beijing has been so successful in its co-optation of global leaders in business, academia, and politics that they have all but turned a blind eye. In fact, this was on full display in late December as the European Union gleefully announced its trade deal with the PRC. As usual, they chose the devil's bargain, as the agreement has little to no safeguards against forced human rights abuses, including slave labor. And what is so terrible is that over 83 corporations or global brands are profiting from these forced labor practices throughout Xinjiang. This is pointed out by Ben Rogers' report, The Darkness Deepens, which he will highlight here this morning, and a report this week by the U.S. Horizon Advisory on the use of forced labor in the solar industry. How can we be so righteous about climate change initiatives if we are to allow the major players to use slave labor? I call on citizens to demand that the brands they buy from adhere to their corporate social responsibility commitments and say no to Chinese partnerships that endanger and enslave minority classes. I call on parliamentarians and world leaders to drop their hypocrisy and stop selling out to corporate interests, or to say no to financial inducements from Beijing, to which so many are beholden to. But of course, there is much more to the story, and as a publisher, I have a front seat to the Communist Party of China's global ambitions and their criminal enterprise. This year, Optimum will publish 3 sensational books on transnational organized crime, covert and overt espionage, bribery, political influence, Mexican-Colombian drug cartels, terrorism, money laundering, luxury homes, fast cars, and gambling. The catch is they all roll up to the Communist Party of China. In May, we will launch Willful Blindness, how a network of narcos, tycoons, and CCP agents infiltrated the West, by investigative reporter Sam Cooper from Global News. A book like no other that documents China Incorporated and the entire criminal apparatus that they have used to infiltrate all democracies. So if the world leaders believe they are bargaining with people of principle and mutual respect, please dispense with that notion. Today, you will hear from some of the foremost experts on human rights abuse in China. You will hear from co-chairs of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, Reinhard Budekoffer and Erwin Kotler, as well as advisors to the Alliance, Ben Rogers and Mariki Olberg. I would like to thank my co-chairs, Charles Burton and Ben Rogers, for their tireless contributions to bringing forward the stories that no one wanted to hear. And to Hong Kong Watch, the China Democracy Foundation, and IPAC. Thank you, and enjoy our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. Now we'll start off with the first panel, the title of it being What Happened with China Human Rights in 2020 and the Current State of Affairs. Although I think with our next speaker, we'd like to hear more about what the U.S. plans to do under the new Biden administration. She is Carolyn Bartholomew, the Vice Chairman of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Commission. Chairman Bartholomew has worked at senior levels in the U.S. Congress, serving as counsel, legislative director, and chief of staff to now the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. She was a professional staff member on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and has served as legislative assistant to then U.S. Representative Bill Richardson. In these positions, Chairman Bartholomew was integrally involved in developing U.S. policies on international affairs and security matters, and she has particular expertise in U.S.-China relations, including issues related to trade, human rights, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So, Ms. Bartholomew, please.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you to the MLI and to Dean for including me today in today's important discussion. It's always wonderful to participate with an international panel of people. I would start really by saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I understand we have people from all around the world participating. Just briefly, I want to talk a little bit. Obviously everybody is interested in what the Biden administration is going to do, and I can touch on that, I think, a little, or at least hypothesize the same way that other people are doing. But just briefly, a little bit of history on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission is the Congress established 2 separate commissions when it was voting on permanent normal trade relations in 2000, which of course was paving the way for China to join the World Trade Organization. The other China Commission is really the Human Rights Commission, and we were tasked with looking at the national security implications of the U.S.-China economic relationship. And what's been interesting over time is when we first started, those issues were really quite stovepipe. There were people who were concerned about economic issues, people who were concerned about military issues, and we've really seen a merger of those issues, which is one of the reasons that we were really created. Freedom of information, of course, is one of the things that we have been mandated to talk about. And what I have found particularly fascinating, as somebody who's worked on China human rights issues since June 4th, 1989, and the Tiananmen Square massacre, is how these issues have all interconnected and had implications for human rights, and human rights is really an important piece of all of this. I'd point particularly, of course, to corporate social responsibility, the production that's happening, what's going on with slave labor, and the treatment of the Uyghurs, as Xi Jinping's government is becoming more and more repressive. And we're finding crackdowns on other ethnic minorities, moving into the Mongolians. It's an issue of great concern. Over the course of the past year, it's really impossible to get away from thinking about what has happened with Hong Kong, and also threats to Taiwan. And all of those have for the U.S. both national security implications, economic implications, and human rights concerns. One issue in particular, though, that I wanted to really point out where I think that these issues are merging is in the digital realm. Obviously, the surveillance technology that's being used against the Uyghurs is really should be a wake-up call for everybody about the downsides of this interconnected world, the use of technology for repression. One of the hearings that we held, our job is to advise the Congress. I should note, too, that we are strictly bipartisan in my commission. There are 12 commissioners, 6 of us appointed by the House and Senate Democratic leadership, 6 of us appointed by the House and Senate Republican leadership, and we switch back our leadership. One year we have a Democratic chair and a Republican vice chair, and vice versa. But one of the issues that we focused on this year, because I think that it's important, is to talk about China's export of its techno-authoritarianism. So people who were willing to turn a blind eye to China's terrible human rights practices within China itself are now having to confront the fact that China is trying to export a bunch of those practices. And I think that provides a lot of opportunities for the human rights community, for the corporate social responsibility community, and for people concerned about national security to work together. We have also focused some, of course, on finance and investment. What are U.S. investment banks, hedge funds, private equity investing in China? What are the Chinese investments that are coming into the United States? What are the consequences of that investment for our national security, our economic security, and for human rights? Would point to every year we do between 19, 20 to 30 or 40 recommendations to the U.S. Congress to consider. 3 of the ones I would just point out from our 2020 report is that the Commission recommended that Congress adopt the principle of reciprocity as foundational in all of its legislation. And we specifically pointed to the ability of journalists and online media to operate without undue restriction, the ability of NGOs to conduct meaningful engagement with civil society, access for diplomatic personnel. All of those have consequences for tracking what is happening inside of China, particularly on human rights issues. We also recommended that Congress direct the Department of State to produce an annual report detailing China's actions in the UN and its subordinate agencies that are subverting the principles and purposes of the UN, including on human rights issues. And finally, I would just point out for this year, Congress that we want Congress to direct the administration that when it is sanctioning an entity in the PRC for actions contrary to the economic and national security interests of the U.S. or for violations of human rights, that they also sanction the parent entity. So we have a full range of issues. And as I said, we sort of started out talking about economics and national security separately, but now I think they are just so intertwined, and human rights is a major component of all of those issues moving forward. So I'm very interested to hear what the other panelists and the other discussion today is talking about, how we can all work together. One thing I will say, and I'll say it again in closing, is I am hopeful that the Biden administration will be able to repair the tatters of the relationships that the United States has with countries around the world, and that will help provide a platform for everybody to move together on these issues. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Reinhard Bütikofer, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Greens. He sits on the European Parliament's Committee on Foreign Affairs, where he serves as the Green Foreign Affairs spokesman. And he is the chair of the European Parliament's delegation for relations with the People's Republic of China. So another excellent speaker to tell us what's going on in a major part of the world. Mr. Bütikofer, please.
Thank you, first of all, for having me, and it's a pleasure to share this podium with Mrs. Bartholomew. Unfortunately, we had not been able to meet physically over the last year because of the COVID crisis, but I'm looking forward to a much stronger transatlantic cooperation on China in the year to come. Obviously, the authoritarian and totalitarian repression in China has been increasing over the recent year. On the human rights front, basically everything has been turning south in China, and this has been combined with the development of an always more aggressive opportunism in foreign policy. Obviously, China is a much more powerful reality than it had been just a few years ago, and the regime in Beijing is showing its arrogance, for instance, in the form of the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, with which they shamelessly defend the most terrible oppression as a way of Chinese normality. I would argue that the European Union today is probably more united on China than it would have been 5 years ago. But this is not a comprehensive reality, and there still is quite a lot of compartmentalization in China policy. And a case in point is the one decision last year that was probably the single most important China policy related decision, which was just before the turn of the year, the political agreement on an investment deal with China. Because as I see that, this investment deal had been dealt with as if it could be separated from the human rights reality and from other geopolitical perspectives. I think that is unacceptable, and we are seeing a controversy developing about the content of the deal, about the timing of the deal, and its geopolitical message. And one issue sticks out in this debate, which is the issue of forced labor, or maybe we should say modern slavery. Here, the European Parliament has taken a very tough stance, and obviously the agreed investment deal falls far short of those criteria. But I should remind everybody that no deal is a deal until the European Parliament says deal, because we are the authority that has to ratify such a trade or investment agreement. And I think the debate in the public is just beginning at the moment. I would add, though, that this is not going to be the only front during the year 2021 on which we will be dealing with China. We have just completed the creation of
Sorry, we seem to have lost Mr. Budikofer, but perhaps we could move into some questions, until he comes back. And my first question is for Ms. Bartholomew, and it relates to the recent measures with regard to China in the dying days of the Trump administration. For example, the statement that the provisions on Taiwan, the restrictions on access to Taiwan that the United States had previously enforced would be removed. And just, I think, yesterday, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection said that the Xinjiang ban on tomatoes and cotton over allegations that they're made with forced labor from detained Uyghur Muslims would be stopped from entering the United States. So they're going quite a bit farther than the British and the Canadians have with regard to measures to restrict the import of products of forced labor. So I'm wondering what your view is, Ms. Bartholomew. Is there a difference between the outgoing Republican regime and the consensus in Congress with regard to the way forward for U.S.-China relations?
That's an excellent question, Charles, and lets me make the point that, going back to June 4th, 1989, U.S.-China policy or concerns about U.S.-China issues have really been bipartisan. And, I will always say, I think my colleagues get tired of me say I have been an equal opportunity critic of both Democratic and Republican administrations about what I saw as weaknesses or problems in their China policies. So it is my expectation that despite the terrible mess we're going through here in Washington, D.C., that there will continue to be bipartisan action on bipartisan interest in Congress and bipartisan action. I will credit, for those of you who don't know that I'm a Democrat, I will credit the Trump administration for one thing, and that is for really raising the visibility of these concerns, ongoing concerns in the U.S.-China relationship. I think that they've done they've played a very important role in raising the interest and the concern about a lot of these ongoing, some of us have been raising concerns for the last 20 or 30 years. I think that there is a difference not in recognizing the concerns, but there is sometimes a difference in the tactics. And I think that's what we will wait to see in terms of the Biden administration. I hope that they will accept and continue some of the policies that the Trump administration has done, but I would expect that there will be some modifications. I think that in terms of what the Trump administration has done, some of the actions that they're taking are really embedded in principles that have to do with our interest in and support for basic freedoms in China, for making sure that China's rise onto the global stage is not just promoting authoritarianism worldwide, addressing the challenges to liberal democracy. But I think that, again, some of the tactics, I'm not quite sure what will happen with some of the tariffs. I'm not sure about some of the, how some of these things will be outcome, but I'm encouraged. I think that the Biden administration, people with a lot of experience and expertise will help us reestablish some of the relationships with countries in Europe, with countries elsewhere in the world that have been really sort of reduced to tatters in some places. And I think that will help put together a global alliance to allow everybody to move forward.
Thank you very much. I have another larger question, which is with regard to the upcoming China Winter Olympics. Do you think that the United States would participate in an Olympics in China under the current conditions?
Again, that's an excellent question. I certainly don't feel like I can speak for the Biden administration. We are, congressional advisory, and don't know that I could even say that there would be unanimity within the Congress about what people should do going forward. I think that this is an important issue. Again, we're working together with other countries in the world to come to some sort of unified position. And I think that it's also really important that citizens in all of our countries get engaged to speak out. Athletes, it's just been interesting to watch that athletes that have gotten more political, but there's a lot of money at stake for some of these people, and we've got really playing out that the balance or the tension that we see playing out between economic interests and all of the rest of our concerns, the human rights concerns. So I don't know, Charles. I'm just going to admit I don't know the answer to your question. But I think it's things that, it's certainly something that the human rights community needs to be organizing toward and about. I don't understand how we could, personally, I'll say I don't understand how we could move forward with the Olympics in a context where we know that this kind of repression is taking place. But I think it's a challenge for all of the people of conscience in all of our countries to make sure that they are weighing in and putting together campaigns to address that question.
Yes, it seems like the Olympics sort of contains all the elements of the difficulties that we have with regard to China as a rising power. Mr. Butikofer, do you have any views on the European attitude towards the upcoming Olympics? Well, I guess
as far as I have heard, there has only been one person in public office, a liberal legislator from the European Parliament, that has openly advocated boycotting the Olympics. It's hardly a debate at all in the European public, and frankly, I can't see that there would be a major push around Europe for boycotting the Olympics. Just as I can see the US doing that. Maybe politicians might not travel there, but as far as I heard from members of Congress, in particular members from the Senate, nobody thinks that it is realistic to pursue such an agenda. That should, of course, not imply that we resign to just letting the Chinese leadership celebrate while they oppress their own people. But I think we should find other ways of addressing that. And in particular, I think no democratic politician should join the celebrations if the atrocities will continue as they probably exist in China.
Thank you very much. Now we have
sorry,
to move.
could I just add one thing? I think
Absolutely.
Reinhold's comments are very interesting. That though, we're often asked, how can grassroots citizens in our countries do something, right? I mean, people want to know, what can they do? They read these stories about the Uyghurs. They read stories about crackdowns on freedom of religion and concern about Tibet and all of the human rights lawyers who are being arrested. What's happening in Hong Kong, where these young people who've had the courage to speak out are being thrown in jail. I just think that it is something specific that we can point people towards to try to have some impact on. People, again, they want to know, what is it that they can do? And I think that the Olympics, although perhaps a boycott goes too far, the Olympics are really a forum that people can start organizing around.
Thank you very much. We're just about to finish off the panel, but I wonder, I have one question that's rather pressing, which is, you made allusion to U.S. concerns over digital censorship in China, the Great Wall, the Great Firewall, and also the restrictions on the ability of non-governmental organizations, civil society, to function in China. And I can certainly see that the Chinese restrictions against these are a violation of the universal principles of human rights as articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and related covenants. But more precisely, what can the United States do to address this violation of the human rights of Chinese citizens with regard to their freedom of expression and freedom of assembly?
Well, I think certainly they can, our officials need to be raising those issues. I would say for parliamentarians, we have always encouraged the parliamentarians in any discussions that they have with Chinese government officials. I'm not going to say counterparts. Our elected officials are free and fair elections, and we know that that's not what happens with the NPC. So I think raising the visibility of the issues. I know the incoming National Security Advisor has said that human rights is going to be one of the pillars and themes that they make important. And I think that, it's incumbent again on all of us and in the human rights community to come up with new tools. I always think what's important is mobilizing our citizens to put pressures on politicians to do things, and would say that Reinhardt made reference to the wolf warrior diplomacy, that there's a lot of opportunity that I think that the Chinese government has really overplayed its hand in terms of the tactics that it is employing around the world diplomatically, economic coercion. And I think that for a lot of people in the world, recognizing that what has happened with COVID-19 and that It is restrictions on Chinese freedom of information and the censorship that they did, which helped to unleash COVID-19, the coronavirus, on all of us. So I think that there's opportunities there for people to step up to make sure that there is some focus, and that we hold our elected officials accountable to raising these concerns and getting some action on them.
Thank you very much. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to give it to Mr. Butikofer. And I wonder if you could expand a bit on your views on coming up with an alliance of democracies to challenge China's violations of the international rules-based order, as has been proposed by President-elect Biden.
Well, this idea is not originally, if I recall correctly, an idea that came up with Joe Biden. If my memory doesn't fail me, John McCain advocated similar ideas more than 10 years ago. I think it's a pertinent proposal, and it is not just an organizational idea. I think what is most important is the practical dimension of having each other's back between countries. Like when you look at what the Chinese are trying to do to the Australians at the moment, it should be the sacred obligation of any other democratic country to support the Australians, or supporting Canada when 2 Canadian citizens are still held hostage in China, or when the Chinese foreign minister spoke very arrogantly and very aggressively about a Czech politician visiting Taiwan, that the German foreign minister in the shared press conference took him to task for that and told him off. This willingness to not tolerate China's efforts to separate and divide European and other democratic nations, and to go for them one by one. I think that is a practical necessity, apart from holding a big conference, apart from organizing maybe a new organization. If we don't live the solidarity between democracies in everyday life, it doesn't exist.
Thank you very much. That's a very inspirational point that I think we'll probably be able to bring up further, and particularly in panel 2 and panel 3. So thank you, Mr. Butikofer, and thank you very much, Ms. Bartholomew, for your very insightful presentations. Now we'll move on to panel 2, entitled Defending Human Rights. And first up is Benedict Rogers. Benedict Rogers' range of activities in support of human rights in China is an inspiration, I think, to me, and should be to all of us. He is the co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch. He's a member of the advisory group of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. He's a member of the advisory committee of Stop Uyghur Genocide, and deputy chair of the United Kingdom Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, and a leading contributor to the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission's China report, The Darkness Deepens, which Dean alluded to. It was just launched yesterday, and I certainly urge all of us listening to today's webinar to download and read this very important document. Ben, please tell us your views on everything about what's wrong with China.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be with you all today to contribute to this incredibly important discussion. Indeed, I think this is the key challenge of our time at a moment when the world, of course, faces many challenges. I'm going to start specifically with the situation in Hong Kong and then broaden out into the wider range of issues. And I start by saying that the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, autonomy, and the rule of law, the conversion, if you like, of what was once one of Asia's most open cities into a closed, repressive territory, in flagrant breach of an international treaty, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, is or should be for the free world a wake-up call, a glimpse into the real character of the Chinese Communist Party regime, a regime that, as we've already heard in the first panel, has over the last has always been repressive, but over the last decade has become increasingly and more intensely repressive, and one whose word cannot be trusted. In the past 6 months since the imposition of the draconian national security law in Hong Kong, we have seen that whatever remained of Hong Kong's freedoms have effectively disappeared. To paraphrase the famous words of Martin Niemöller in Nazi Germany, first they came for the protesters, but then they came for the legislators, and now the Legislative Council has no pro-democracy members in it and is a total puppet of Beijing. Then they've been coming for the media with the particular targeting of Jimmy Lai and academia and schooling, and already the judiciary, religious freedom and civil society are targeted in Hong Kong, a place where all these things were almost taken for granted until recently. Every week in Hong Kong, activists have been arrested. On the 6th of January, 53 pro-democracy former legislators, candidates, activists were arrested in one go for the simple crime, in inverted commas, of having conducted a primary election to choose their candidates last summer. And yet again today, 11 arrests have been made in Hong Kong. Why does all this matter? Well, firstly, if we allow the destruction of a free city to take place with impunity, then it is not only a threat to the people of Hong Kong, it is a threat to freedom itself. And we can be sure that the regime will not stop with Hong Kong. Taiwan is already in its sights, and our own freedoms as well. But secondly, what is happening in Hong Kong is just a fraction of the atrocious human rights crackdown throughout China. Last night, as you've already mentioned, in London, the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission launched this very important new report, The Darkness Deepens, which details the Chinese Communist Party's violations across the board. The persecution of Uyghurs, which is increasingly recognized as a genocide, the persecution of Christians, which can be described as the worst that they've faced since the Cultural Revolution, intensifying repression in Tibet, the persecution of Falun Gong, forced organ harvesting, the development of the surveillance state, the crackdown on human rights defenders, civil society, bloggers, citizen journalists, whistleblowers, and any form of dissent. And the report, which I should say, although it's from the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, it ought to be a report that should be of interest to people regardless of party politics. It's not a party political report, it's a human rights report. And it calls on, and this reinforces the points that have been made in the first panel, it calls on the democratic world to unite to stand up to the regime's increasing repression at home and aggression beyond its borders. It sets out a range of recommendations, which we could perhaps explore in the discussion, and it calls for a long overdue response to what it describes at the end of its concluding chapter, and with these words I conclude, it describes as, quote, the mendacity, brutality, inhumanity, insecurity, and criminality of the Chinese Communist Party regime. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that excellent presentation that raises many questions that we'll try and address in the discussion period. Our next speaker is Tung Biao. Mr. Tung is really China's most distinguished human rights defending legal scholar, able to be active today. Dr. Tung has courageously defended cases in China involving freedom of expression, religious freedom, the death penalty, Tibetans and Uyghurs. He has taught at the China University of Politics and Law in Beijing and has been a visiting scholar at Yale, Harvard, New York University, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Dr. Tung was one of the initiators of the Charter 08 document and has been recognized by numerous international awards, including the Human Rights Prize of the French Republic in 2007. He is currently Grove Human Rights Scholar at Hunter College and the Posen Visiting Professor at the University of Chicago. Mr. Tung, please.
Thank you very much. I teach a course titled Human Rights in China, and we talk about political and civil rights, and as well as culture and economic rights. Actually, Chinese government violated every fundamental human right. China is one of the three countries that people cannot access to Google, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. China is the biggest prison of bloggers, journalists, and writers and human rights defenders. Especially after Xi Jinping came to power in late 2012, the crackdown on civil society and the human rights movements became more and more brutal. Not only human rights lawyers and dissidents were targeted, but also everything in the civil society, like the internet, underground churches, like universities and non-governmental organizations, underground churches, everything. And leading human rights lawyer Gao Zisheng has been totally disappeared for more than 3 years and a half. Another friend of mine, Geng Xiaonan, she is not an activist, but an entrepreneur and activist willing to help other activists and political prisoners. And then she was arrested, being charged with kind of illegal business. And we found that not only the frontline defenders were persecuted, but other activists and organizations focusing on labor rights or environmental or LGBT feminism cannot continue their human rights work. And of course, we know the Xinjiang concentration camps, more than 1.5 million people are being detained in these concentration camps, and also in Tibet, more than 500,000 Tibetan farmers are detained in the military-style labor camps. And also Mongolia, and Chinese government is trying to eliminate the identity, the culture, and the religions of Mongolian people, like they did in Tibet and East Turkestan. So, by the way, many Western scholars said China is authoritarian system, but my argument is that since 1949, China is not an authoritarian but a totalitarian system. And what's even worse, now the Chinese Communist Party is establishing a high-tech totalitarianism. They are using all these high technologies like the social media, internet, the Great Firewall, the telecommunications, and the social credit system, DNA and artificial intelligence to tighten its total control. So this is an unprecedented high-tech totalitarian system, and it's becoming more and more aggressive on the international stage. Yesterday, I mentioned the case of Gui Minhai, but actually Chinese government kidnapped people in Thailand, Burma, and Vietnam, and there have been several such cases. And the Tibetan activists, the Uyghur activists, Chinese citizens in other countries, in the United States, Canada, and Europe, had been harassed and monitored and even physically attacked. So finally, I think my point is we should drag Beijing of 2022 Olympics. It's a challenge to everyone's conscience if we give Beijing the opportunity to host the Olympic game and to travel to Beijing in 2022, celebrating the Olympic Games when the genocide is ongoing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tung. Our next speaker is Rahima Mahmoud. Ms. Mahmoud is a Uyghur singer, a human rights activist, award-winning translator of the poignant prison memoir, The Land Drenched in Tears. She has served as consultant.
Live streaming is on.
Ms. Mahmoud was consultant and translator for the ITV documentary Undercover, Inside China's Digital Gulag, shown in July 2019, which won many major awards, and I urge everyone to have a look at that. Currently, she is the UK project director of the World Uyghur Congress and serves as an advisor to the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. Ms. Mahmoud, please.
Thank you very much. It is a great privilege to be with you here today. I was born in the city of Gulja in the north of Uyghur region. I was brought up in a large religious family. The discrimination and the persecution of the Uyghur people has a long history. From my childhood until I left my homeland in 2000, as a Uyghur, I experienced frequent discrimination and witnessed brutal crackdowns on any moderate dissenting voices. This includes the Tiananmen massacre in 1989 and the Gulja massacre in 1997. Since coming to the UK in 2000, I have been unable to return to my homeland because of my activism against the Chinese government in support of my people. The last time I spoke to my brother in January 2017, he told me in a trembling voice, "Please leave us in God's hands." My work as an interpreter and translator brings me into contact with first-hand accounts of suffering in the notorious 21st century concentration camps, as well as the heart-wrenching tales of mothers and fathers who have lost their children, young and old. Every Uyghur family has a similar story, each one more horrifying than the other, of the effects of the brutal ethnic cleansing and genocide that have taken place since 2017, while the world closes its eyes to their suffering. The most painful part of the job is not being able to offer words of comfort and hope in the midst of the torment. Since August 2018, when the UN acknowledged that there were up to 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims interned in what the Chinese called re-education camps, a growing number of courageous individuals have been working towards exposing the truth of life behind their walls. One of the camp survivors, Gulbahar Haitwaji, whose testimony was published on The Guardian on Tuesday, she said, "They had tortured my body and brought my mind to the edge of madness. Women like me who emerged from the camp are no longer who we once were. We are shadows. Our souls are dead." I worked as a consultant and translator for the documentary Undercover China's Digital Gulag by Robin Bunwell. I was horrified when a Chinese official was asked whether he felt Uyghurs' human rights were being violated. And he responded by saying, "They don't have human rights. It's not about violation. They just don't have human rights." An IT expert who worked for a state-controlled high-tech surveillance company stated that everyone was fearful, whether those already taken inside or those who are waiting to be taken in. Our relatives under the influence of the state terror dare not even greet one another openly without fear. It is unbearable to describe the life there. A knock on the door from anyone would bring extreme anxiety and fright. This is the situation from my own as Uyghur experience. Uyghurs, whether they are living in my own country or in exile, we are suffering. We really need the world to act and to protect our very basic rights and our identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Perhaps I could continue asking you a question, Ms. Mahmoud. And this is with regard to the recent developments, Canada joining Britain on Tuesday and announcing steps to ban the import of goods that it said are made by Chinese forced labor in the region that China calls Xinjiang. There is a question by Mr. Li Pa, who says, yesterday Canada clamped down on imports it said were made by forced labor. Is this good enough? What can democratic countries do to help? And yesterday, the US announced it will ban imports of all cotton and tomato products from that region because of the allegations of production under forced labor. This would be, I think it's about 84% of cotton out of China is produced in the Xinjiang region, if I understand correctly. So there are two questions really here. One is, do you think that Canada and the US, Canada and the Britain have gone far enough to ensure the enforcement and accountability of importers for the products of this forced labor? And the second aspect takes it the other way, which is that if the US bans all imports of cotton and tomato products and the other countries start to follow suit, will this have a negative impact on the livelihood of Uyghurs in China who are engaged in production of these products? So could it actually increase their suffering if they're left unable to export their agricultural commodities that they produce there?
Thank you very much. First of all, we welcome the move. There is this action is very important. I mean, it's a small step, very first step from UK and Canada. But we do feel sanction, especially clear sanctions on individuals and the companies that abusing the rights of the Uyghurs is very important. And US have already done that, has already sanctioned the officials and the entities. And why not UK and Canada? So that is one of the very important measures that we expect the free world should follow. And to your second question regarding the products that is banned, whether the Uyghurs will suffer, but Uyghurs already suffering. Uyghurs, the very basic rights, the very basic human dignity is being stripped off, and the only way that we can hurt CCP is to punish using this kind of sanctions. And I know my people never benefited, apart from very small minorities, never benefited from this economic development and economic gains from the CCP regime. Thank you.
Thank you for the answer. I have a question here. Well, I have a series of questions from the audience that I'd like to direct to Ben. The first one, Jonathan G. asks, do you have any advice for young people who want to get involved, and what can they do? Jerry asks, what is the best way to help the situation, both in terms of policy with regard to Hong Kong or Taiwan, and in terms of private life? Gloria asks, how can grassroots Canadian citizens help to prevent or even stop these dreadful human rights issues? And finally, Josh asks, what can the Chinese diaspora outside the PRC do to help on these issues? So clearly, Ben, a lot of people are interested in getting involved to try and make a stand against China's violations of the international rules-based order and the defense of human rights in Hong Kong and Taiwan. What do we suggest that they can practically do to bring this about?
Well, I'm very heartened by those questions. And I think there are a number of ways that people can get involved. Firstly, they can make contact with advocacy organizations. Hong Kong Watch is one of them, but I know there are a number of organizations in Canada, the United States, and around the world. So wherever listeners are, they can make contact with those groups and get involved. And I think one of the things that is so particular about our democratic systems is that our elected representatives do, or at least there's a chance that they will, respond to pressure from their constituents. So I would encourage people to really engage their members of parliament, their members of Congress in the United States, their elected representatives, and we can help provide more information on that. So certainly anyone who wants to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter, there are other ways to reach me, and we can provide more information. But I think lobbying your elected representatives and also looking at what consumer action could be done. And then lastly, very briefly, of course, some of our countries, particularly the United Kingdom and Canada, are very likely to welcome quite a number of Hong Kongers in the coming months who leave Hong Kong. And there are ways to engage with them, make them feel welcome, and work with them in this struggle.
Thank you very much for those suggestions, and I think a lot of people will take up your offer to connect with you to collaborate in this kind of grassroots movement. Finally, one last question from Katerina, and it's directed at Dr. Tung Biao. And the question is, what would be the best strategies, in your opinion, for European countries, Canada, and the United States to employ to weaken the Chinese Communist Party's power in China and abroad? Mr. Tung?
Thank you. First thing is the world, the free world should realize the failure of engagement, the previous engagement policy. Of course, China had made progress under this engagement policy, but when the Chinese Communist Party sensed the threat from the civil society using legal channels and free information, they decided to eliminate all these freedom elements. I think one strategy is to link human rights to everything that the Chinese authorities care about. One example is like Beijing care about the trade, the technology, and one thing is something like Olympic Games. If the world link human rights to the opportunity to host the Olympic Games and other important international forum, that will be effective pressure. Another thing is sanctions. In the United States, there's a Global Magnitsky Act, and last year it passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Freedom and Democracy Act and the Uyghur Human Rights Act, and to sanction the corrupt officials and the people involving violation of human rights. That would be powerful. So I know other countries also adopted the similar acts, and if the whole world, if the democratic countries all have the Magnitsky style sanction, that would be very powerful.
Thank you very much. We have time for closing statements. Perhaps we could start with Ms. Mahmoud. Do you have a few more words to say to close off?
Thank you very much. During this month, the world will mark Holocaust Memorial Day. After World War II and the full revelation of the extent of the Holocaust, the cry never again reverberated around the world. Despite this, the world has repeatedly seen genocide occur. There is no doubt that we Uyghurs are facing genocide. As in all other genocide, women are a prime target. Most women of childbearing age face forced sterilization and birth control. Rape is systematic in the camps, and forced marriage to Han Chinese men is a common practice. So I cannot repeat more what is happening to my country, but what we can do, my colleagues, my friends have already mentioned how the global citizens and the leaders of the world should act. And it is still not too late to act and to fulfill the promise of never again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tung. Tung Biao.
Yes, Chinese government has been an increasing threat to global human rights and freedom and democracy, and we are focusing on human rights issues in China, but it's not only a Chinese issue; it's a global issue, and Chinese government actually. The threats of Western academic freedom and free speech and its democratic values, like Confucius Institute, like Chinese students and scholars associations, and Huawei and other internet technologies. So, as I repeatedly said, the unprincipled engagement is kind of appeasement, and if the world continues to appease the Chinese government, and that will be a disaster for everyone. And the Western value, the liberal democracy and open society will be in danger. And we should fundamentally change our thinking of the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you very much. And final word on this panel to you, Ben.
Thank you. Well, the report that we launched yesterday, as you've heard, is called The Darkness Deepens. And one of the reasons for the title of that was that in 2016, we published a previous report that was titled The Darkest Moment. That title came from some words of a Chinese dissident who said then in 2016 that it was the darkest moment since Tiananmen. And when we saw in this inquiry that the situation has worsened even further, we had, of course, the linguistic challenge of how do we title it as a follow-on to The Darkest Moment. But that's why we came up with this title. And I would simply say that if we continue to appease and kowtow to and fail to act in response to this human rights tragedy, then the darkness will continue to deepen, and it will engulf us as well sooner or later. So I very much echo what the previous two speakers have said. I think it's time for unity. I think the free world needs to stand together. That doesn't necessarily mean conformity. There's room for a diversity of approaches, but I think the free world needs to coordinate and be seen to be standing together in defense of these values. But also it's time for real concrete action. It's very clear that strong statements, which we've seen more of, and they're welcome, but strong statements alone no longer cut it.
Yes, I must say I couldn't agree with you more on that. And certainly in the case of my government, it seems that our attitude towards China is moving from concern to serious concern to very serious concern. But practically speaking, we're not seeing any measures to give the Chinese authorities incentive to come more into compliance with the international norms of diplomacy and human rights. So now we'll move on to panel 3, entitled How Governments Can Hold China to Account for China's Gross Violations of the Norms of the International Rules-Based Order and the Way Ahead for Democratic Nations' Engagement of the PRC regime. Our first speaker is Marika Olberg. She is a senior fellow in the Asia program of the German Marshall Fund. Previously, she worked at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for China Studies, where she co-authored the landmark report, Authoritarian Advance, Responding to China's Growing Political Influence in Europe. Her articles have been published in the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Neue Zürcher Zeitung, and her recent book with Clive Hamilton, Hidden Hand, exposing how the Chinese Communist Party is reshaping the world, released last year, has become an international bestseller. She has enormous influence on this public awareness and debate over how to address the Chinese Communist Party's geostrategic intentions, malignant geostrategic intentions throughout the world. And I very much look forward to hearing what you have to say, Marika, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Charles. I'm very honored to be on this panel. I will probably focus first on the situation that we're facing and then hope to address more the way forward in the Q&A part. So we've been in this prolonged phase of trying to find a new approach to China policy after it has become super clear that engagement, which is called change through trade in Germany, where I live, is clearly no longer working. It may have been an honest approach in the 90s or even 10 years ago, but whatever thin veil of legitimacy this approach of if we engage China, it'll automatically change used to have, it's clear now that this did not happen and it's actually resulting in the opposite. I don't think I have to tell anybody on this call that not only has the Chinese Communist Party become more repressive at home, but it has also been trying a lot harder to export its norms globally. So Chinese human rights ultimately concern us all. To give just one example, Hong Kong's new national security law has global reach in an attempt to get people around the world to censor what they say and do. US citizens are wanted under the national security law. Just recently, Hong Kong authorities discussed the possibility to prosecute Danish parliamentarians for helping Hong Kong lawmaker Ted Hui escape to Denmark. It probably won't happen, but this is supposed to have a chilling effect. We have seen more and more people in various countries across the world waking up to the challenge. Nonetheless, finding good policy on China often feels like one step forward, two steps back. One example that Reinhard Bütikofer already brought up earlier on this call is the most recent European Commission's decision, very much led by Germany and France, to commit to the investment agreement with China, which is premised on the idea that China is now simply so powerful, any potential access is good access, which has incredibly weak language on holding China to account on labor rights, just acknowledging that China will continue to make efforts to ratify the convention, which is the weakest kind of language you can have. That is the kind of step that, to me, if it actually does go through and is not stopped at the European Parliament, would signify 10 steps back. But this does not come out of nowhere. This is the result of an increasingly sophisticated propaganda apparatus on the CCP side that is convincing more and more people of its narratives, its talking points, the idea that the world needs China so much it cannot afford to confront it. It's the result of aggressive influence efforts to win over political elites in pretty much any country in the world. It's the result of business lobbies with an interest in the Chinese market that push governments in a direction that makes it incredibly difficult to come up with solid China policy, which might not even change China, but at least would limit our own complicity in human rights violations and raise the cost for the CCP to continue its human rights violations. To that, you have to add a good dose of defeatism, the idea, well, China is too economically important, we just can't afford. It's just a fact we have to accept. And quite a bit of cynicism as well. Let's face it, nobody really cares about human rights. That's how things go. This really only, quote unquote, and affects minorities and Hong Kongers and Taiwanese. It'll never affect us, despite very clear evidence to the contrary. So I'm very happy to have the topic of this panel here to look at what can actually be done in all of this. Parliamentary alliances like IPAC and parliamentary campaigns on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet stand out as one of the few truly good developments in recent years. Parliaments can help draw attention to issues by simply raising them. There is some good executive action too. I am not known as a friend of Donald Trump. I thoroughly dislike him. Nonetheless, some action, such as banning cotton and tomatoes from Xinjiang, is good action and will have good consequences. This is hard work, it's difficult work, it's frustrating work, but it's continuing, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what my co-panelists who are more directly involved in that work have to say. I will stop here and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Stephen Kinnock. Since 2015, Mr. Kinnock has been the Labour member of the Parliament of the United Kingdom for Aberfan in the House of Commons. In April 2020, he was promoted to Shadow Foreign Office Minister with responsibility for Asia and the Pacific. Mr. Kinnock is the author of A New Nation, Building a United Kingdom of Purpose, Patriotism and Resilience, came out in 2015, and the co-author of Spirit of Britain, Purpose of Labour, published in 2018. So, Mr. Kinnock, please.
Well, thank you very much, and many thanks to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for organising such an important meeting today. I wanted to start by saying really that the issue we're discussing today is not a question of left or right, it's a question of right or wrong. And that's why I think the parliamentary and political cooperation that we're seeing on this issue on both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed in many other democracies, and particularly democracies in the Indo-Pacific region, demonstrates that the issues of human rights and our basic liberal democratic values transcend the day-to-day back and forth of party politics. And you know, it's very good to see people such as Benedict Rogers on the panel, and you know, we've been working closely together because this issue does transcend normal political boundaries. Having said that, I think we need to be honest about the fact that in the UK over the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of naivety and complacency in the way that we've been dealing with China, and successive Conservative governments have pursued this so-called golden era strategy, whereby there would be increasing trade and economic interaction with China, and in return China would slowly but surely align with the norms and rules of the international order. And clearly that strategy has been a spectacular failure, and instead we see China increasingly violating human rights. We see what's happening in Hong Kong, we see what's happening in Xinjiang, and also we're not seeing any real change in terms of the way that China behaves commercially, with an increasing amount of industrial espionage and stealing of intellectual property. So, you know, we still have that trade-based issue as well. So what we need to do, I think, is to look at two strategic pillars for our strategy and a number of specific actions. Strategically, I think we need to do two things. We've got to reduce our dependence on China's supply chains. That means building our own technology base and working across democratic countries to do that. We've got to also then become an alliance maker rather than an alliance breaker. Whatever your opinion on Brexit, I think we have to recognise that the United Kingdom over the last 4 years has burned a lot of bridges, and we've got to find a way of rebuilding those bridges. And I think, in fact, working on the issue of China, which is the primary issue the global community faces at the moment, how to respond to the rise of China, is a way of also rebuilding, for the United Kingdom to start to rebuild some of those alliances and to become a transatlantic bridge between the United States and the European Union, and also reaching out to the democracies in the Indo-Pacific region. So two strategic pillars: reduce strategic dependence so that we're no longer compromised by such economic reliance on China, and secondly, start rebuilding some of these alliances. And then in terms of specific measures, I would like to just briefly mention three. There are many that could be taken, but first of all, Magnitsky sanctions. It's completely outrageous that the British government has still not included a single Chinese Communist Party official on any of the Magnitsky sanctions that have been deployed in the last 6 to 8 months or so. That has to change. We've been pressing very hard for that, and we will continue to build alliances with conservative members of parliament who agree with us. Second is on human rights due diligence in supply chains. Our Modern Slavery Act is not fit for purpose. We should be looking at the best practice of the French Vigilance Act and giving much more teeth so that companies can be sanctioned for failing to have human rights due diligence in their supply chains. And thirdly, there's a big opportunity coming up in the British Parliament next week where the trade bill is coming back. We are tabling amendments to that bill, which would enable courts to create a preliminary determination of genocide. And where that preliminary determination exists, any trade negotiations with any country that's guilty of genocide would have to be discontinued. So there's a big opportunity for cross-party cooperation there. We're in active discussions around the trade bill and amending the trade bill. So I hope that that gives you a sense of, first of all, a kind of two key strategic elements to the reset, the fundamental reset we need in our China strategy, and then 3 concrete actions and specific actions that need to be taken. Thank you very much, Chair.
You're muted, Charles.
Okay, well, anyway, I was expressing great enthusiasm for the presentation of Mr. Kinnock, but we'll get more to that in the questions. Now we turn to Erwin Kotler. Mr. Kotler is the chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He is an emeritus professor of law at McGill University, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, and an international human rights lawyer. He was a member of the international legal team for Chinese Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo. He has also acted as a lawyer defending very world-renowned prisoners of conscience, such as Andrei Sakharov and Nathan Sharansky, and also Nelson Mandela. I think I can say without question to my mind that Mr. Kotler is the most respected Canadian living today. It is a great honor for us to have him with us at this event. Mr. Kotler.
Thank you, Charles, for those very kind words. I still recall your expert testimony before our parliamentary committees, which brought about whatever modest action and too modest action that we took. The commission report that we've been discussing related witness testimony and documentary evidence, as we've heard in this panel, has really sounded the alarm on the multi-pronged assault by Beijing on the rules-based legal order. And where Xi Jinping's China, and I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics in China who are the targets of that mass repression, where it has emerged as the greatest threat to international peace, security, and human rights today. The deepening darkness, as Ben referred to it, which has included the targeting of what they have called the 5 poisons. In other words, the mass atrocities against the Uyghurs, the draconian national security legislation criminalizing fundamental freedoms in Hong Kong, and really an assault not only on protesters, but on democracy itself. The ongoing persecution and prosecution of the Falun Gong, the intensification of the repression of Tibetans, the threatening of Taiwan, and it doesn't end there. We have also the coercive organ harvesting, which has been characterized as crimes against humanity. As Dr. Tong has put it, the war on law and lawyers, the jailing of journalists, suppression of information, the disappearance of doctors and dissidents, which precipitated and account for the spread of the coronavirus to begin with, the massive forced labor, which has been correctly characterized as enslavement, the something that is not always acknowledged and appreciated, the endemic, widespread, systematic torture that is being engaged in, the corruption of UN agencies, covert, overt penetration and espionage internationally, the development and deployment of a mass surveillance state, and, as you have mentioned, the arrests and abductions and practice of hostage diplomacy. So given all this wake-up call, what then must we do? And for reasons of time, a series of one-liners in terms of action. Number one, we should enhance and support the work of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, whose very founding and initiatives has served as a wake-up call re Beijing's brutality, and no less important, an antidote to its bullying. To establish a parallel intergovernmental alliance of democracies to secure justice and accountability. 3, enhance the parliamentary determination of the mass atrocities against the Uyghurs as acts constitutive of genocide, as the Canadian Parliament has done, and support judicial determinations of genocide as made possible by the UK legislation and initiatives, read the ICE International Criminal Court. 4, support, as has been mentioned, global justice for Sergei Magnitsky sanctions. The very adoption recently by the EU of a Magnitsky sanctions regime enhances the capacity for that purpose. Number 5, strong statements, as has been mentioned, are not enough. One needs actions on all fronts, whether it be actions to prohibit the import of produce of slave labor, or actions to hold Beijing accountable for its mass atrocities. In a word, words are not enough. Action must be taken on all fronts. Number 6, call for the UN to appoint an international, independent, impartial investigative inquiry re the mass atrocities in Xinjiang, but as part of a comprehensive strategy to combat Beijing's corruption and indeed criminalization of the conduct of UN agencies, in particular also the UN Human Rights Council. Number 7, invoke the panoply of legal remedies to hold Beijing accountable for its responsibility in the spread of the coronavirus. 8, institute immigration and refugee safe harbor initiatives re Hong Kong Uyghurs fleeing persecution and prosecution. Number 9, protest against the export of the surveillance state, including its penetration, espionage, and not to be forgotten, the persecution and harassment of the Chinese diasporas, and in particular, Uyghurs, Falun Gongs, etc. Number 10, mobilize the international bar associations, the American Bar Association, to unmask and expose the assault on law and lawyers. And then with regard to the Olympics, I think it is unconscionable to participate in an Olympics when a regime is engaged in such widespread, systematic mass atrocities, including also genocide. And we need to explore alternatives for that. In a word, we have to mobilize a global constituency of conscience and action to hold Beijing accountable, securing justice for its victim and accountability for the violators.
Thank you very much for that very powerful statement, Dr. Kotler. Now we move to the question period, and we have a lot of questions, but fortunately we have a bit of time. First of all, I'd like to engage Mr. Kinnock a bit more. I gather from what you say that the Labour Party would be supportive of the Conservative Party's Human Rights Commission's China report, The Darkness Deepens, that there isn't a lot of sunshine between the two of you, that basically there's a consensus in your faction of the Labour Party and Mr. Benedict's faction of the Conservative Party on that. And I heard you talking about the proposal of Magnitsky sanctions, due diligence in supply chains. And finally, you discussed the Genocide Amendment. I'm wondering, with regard to the Genocide Amendment, whether this would mean that the United Kingdom should go beyond banning tomatoes and cotton, as the United States has done, produced in Xinjiang. Are you really meaning that until China ceases its genocidal policies in Xinjiang, that there would be much more comprehensive trade sanctions against the People's Republic of China proposed by the Labour Party, and would they be implemented if the Labour Party comes to power in the next British general election?
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, just to clarify, the amendment to the trade bill seeks to prevent the United Kingdom government from entering into any trade negotiations with a country where the High Court of the United Kingdom finds that there is a predetermined prima facie case of genocide. Where the court does find that, it would then, there's still some debate on this as to whether it would then need to come back to Parliament, and I think the amendment is still being refined, but we expect the bill to come to Parliament, to the Commons, on Tuesday. So it's not so much about sanctioning ongoing trade, it is about preventing trade negotiations from taking place. So, for example, if an amendment like this was in place within the European Union, then the European Union negotiations of this investment deal with China would not have been possible for them to go ahead.
Yes.
So what it's about is saying we're not going to get into the business of lifting trade barriers through further trade negotiations, reducing quotas and tariffs, etc., with a country where there is a prima facie case of genocide taking place.
So this wouldn't, you wouldn't go backwards on the WTO, which, China is clearly not compliant with the spirit and much of the letter of the WTO.
Well, I think that's something which would be in the next phase of discussion, really. Nobody in the UK is talking actively about sanctions or banning. Well, there may well be people, but not so much in Parliament, sanctions and banning products in terms of current trade that's taking place. But there is a very clear view now that we need to draw a line in the sand, and that further trade negotiations and what would lead to, of course, deeper and more frictionless trade between the United Kingdom and China, or indeed any other country that's got where there's a predetermined case of genocide, should not be allowed to take place. So now we're leaving the European Union, of course, we are able to negotiate because we're outside the customs union of the European Union, and the government is desperately trying to do trade deals with countries all over the world, and that's why it's so important that we urgently put down this line in the sand, because we know that the government will be very keen to try and do a deal with China, and we need to stop that from happening.
Yes. If I could just carry on with a couple more points. How do you feel about the United States' recent change in policy towards U.S. engagement with Taiwan? Do you feel that we should continue, that the global community should continue to shun Taiwan's participation in international organizations and prevent government officials from meeting with their Taiwan counterparts?
Taiwan is, of course, always a difficult line to tread, because we want to make sure that we work in a way that is supportive to the Taiwanese government. And I know that they are very worried, and of course their priority is to protect their own citizens, and they're worried about doing anything that provokes, that pokes the hornet's nest too hard. But frankly, what we're seeing, Taiwanese airspace was buzzed by Chinese Air Force 330 times last year, and they're buzzing Taiwanese airspace every day. China has sent its aircraft carrier into Taiwanese waters and constantly intrudes into Taiwanese territory. So there is a real need for closer cooperation. I think that we should be offering very close support and cooperation on things like cyber security for Taiwan. I think that it's constantly coming under cyber attacks from Beijing, and we should certainly support fully Taiwan's campaign to get observer status at the WHO. When you look at the outstanding performance of Taiwan in terms of dealing with the COVID-19, it's absolutely ludicrous and outrageous that Taiwanese expertise is not able to be brought to bear in the WHO. And I think the other real area of opportunity is cooperation on tech. Taiwan is one of the largest producers of semiconductors in the world. And I think there's a real opportunity here for the Five Eyes and the G7 and democracies in the Indo-Pacific region to pool their resources on technology, everything from 5G mobile networks to internet standards, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and Taiwan can make a major contribution to that so we can compete against China on technology, reduce our strategic dependence on China, and also improve our security. So I would say, let's make sure we work in concert with the Taiwanese authorities. We shouldn't do anything which makes life more difficult for them than they want it to be. But I think big opportunities around cybersecurity, military cooperation, and on technology.
Thank you very much. If I could turn now to Marika. We have a number of questions here about Chinese influence operations, which is, of course, your area of expertise among many. Jonathan R. asks, to what extent is Wall Street helping fuel Beijing's human rights abuses? What can be done to highlight this publicly, shame those involved, and ultimately stop it? Then we've got a question here from Clark, which refers to my own country, Canada. Has the Chinese Communist Party got a hold of top liberals, and has that informed their actions since taking office? And finally, a question from Stephen. What can be done to counter China's peddling of soft influence through universities, company executives, and even elected officials? So what do you think, Marika?
Thank you for these questions. One, yes, in the United States, I would say that Wall Street is definitely one of the actors, collectively speaking, that is pushing against better policy on China that would, I think, very much like for the United States to return back to the status quo ante, or even be more, engage in more appeasement towards the Chinese government, mainly because of financial interests, some interest in terms of market access, some domestic interests in staying on the good side of the Chinese government and make some money there. So that's been a huge problem in terms of getting US policy right. There was a bit of a policy window in recent years to push through some good action that would have otherwise probably been derailed by Wall Street. What can be done to expose it? I mean, one thing really is to honestly just talk about it more. You can talk about it collectively. I think it's very fair to talk about the phenomenon collectively. In our debate on Chinese influence, we really like to focus on much smaller actors that have less power, because that's also less risky, and there is this great aversion to take on the big players, which I think is one of our biggest obstacles in actually tackling this problem. Of course, individual companies can sue you. You need to be a lot more careful. That said, I do think there's been some good investigative journalism done on some of these scandals, on some of the links to China, and some of the problematic action that has resulted from this. And this more in-depth work, alongside the bigger picture of pointing this out again and again as one of the major US issues, will help get the attention onto this, and will also help people become more aware of it, so that they'll be more interested in holding these actors to account. In terms of, just very briefly, what in terms of political influence, the CCP is kind of they connect with anybody. They're kind of an equal opportunity liaison club. So they will try to win over friends in pretty much any party, so that both parties that are not in power, parties that are in power, so that when a new government comes into power, they they will already have friends in that government. That's part of the strategy. So I don't think it would be fair to say that they are focused on liberal parties or on any specific kind of party. Anybody who's perceived to have any impact will be targeted. Finally, what can be done to counter universities? For every country, there will have to be a set of rules around better transparency, better accountability, better China knowledge to get actors, to enable universities and other actors to understand who they're dealing with. Some of this can be the same across different countries. Others will have to be country specific, but this is very detailed things that will need to be done in every country to increase transparency and thereby actually make it a lot harder for anything that is happening in the shadows to have impact at those universities. Again, long, hard work, but very much worth it.
So, are you saying that, for example, that Australia's Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act would not be applicable more or less to many different countries? Are there legislative barriers, say charters of rights and freedoms that inhibit the potential adoption of this legislation in different political contexts?
I mean, it depends on the country. It may be in some. I think in many countries, it might actually, I don't see anything immediate other than there will be resistance toward it that will be context specific. I don't have any example of any specific barriers in a particular country against adopting a similar scheme. It's a scheme that's been criticized a lot. I think it's good to raise transparency on this, so I am actually quite supportive of it by and large. And I do think, I'm not saying by saying there need to be specific actions, I'm not saying that countries can't learn from one another. I've just found, specifically working in the field of universities, it's been very difficult to find universally binding approaches because each country's university system works quite differently. In Germany, we have a lot of public universities that don't depend on tuition fees, but we have other problems. So that's kind of more what I was thinking when I was not trying to suggest that there is no way from countries not to learn from one another and to look for examples of legislation they can adopt. It might have to be adapted a little bit. I think that's always going to be the case, but absolutely, please do go and look what other countries are doing and what might work in your country as well.
Thank you very much. If I could turn to Mr. Kotler, Dr. Kotler, and ask a similar question, which is, do you think that there are legislative difficulties in implementing legislation in Canada, like the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act in Australia? This act is opposed by some members of the Canadian government, particularly Senator Yuen Pao Wu in Canada, who has posted on his website a strong series of reasons why he doesn't think that legislation would be appropriate for Canada. But, sunshine being the best disinfectant, are there barriers to requiring that current and former policymakers should report any benefits that they receive from a foreign state? Or is this just not consistent with Canada's constitutional framework?
No, I don't see it as being inconsistent with our constitutional framework, and we already have in place, reporting mechanisms for purposes of disclosure. All this is seen as being part of a code of conduct for responsibility by parliamentarians in these matters. So, no, I don't see that being a problem, and I think we need to both have enhanced transparency and accountability.
But what about post-career? We see a phenomenon where politicians and senior civil servants who, while they were in positions of public trust, appear to have been resistant to adopting policies that would challenge the interests of the People's Republic of China in Western democracies like Canada. And then after retirement, you see them benefiting significantly from positions on China-related boards or law firms. Charlie Parton of the Royal United Services Institute in Britain, referring to this phenomenon in Britain, talks about life-transforming amounts of money. Is there any way that, we don't have what you might say like a smoking gun where the Chinese ambassador says to a Canadian foreign minister, if you don't challenge us on the South China Sea human rights or genocide or whatever, we'll take care of you in retirement. But that does seem to be something that appears to be the case, that there are senior Canadian policymakers who are benefiting enormously from relations with China after retirement, and there doesn't seem to be any requirement that they either report their source of income or be constrained from receiving income from foreign powers once they've left public service.
Well, we've instituted in Canada certain restraints and regulations with respect to parliamentarians being able to lobby the Canadian government after their retirement from office. And since we have those kinds of initiatives, which we've already instituted with respect to domestic lobbying, I think we can certainly explore and at the very least have transparency with regard to engagement with foreign countries, particularly when we are dealing with countries that may be part of a pattern of gross human rights violations. You can't, on the one hand, have Magnitsky sanctions seeking justice and accountability through Magnitsky sanctions, but at the same time say it's former parliamentarians or even worse, government ministers can instantly begin to engage with those that are being targeted for Magnitsky sanctions. So I think this is something that is worth exploring and, in fact, developing codes of conduct in that regard.
And so if I could ask you one further question, and this is with regard to the future of coming up with a common approach to China by governments. You are strongly endorsing the IPAC, which of course is a wonderful organization, but we see governments around the world who are reluctant to engage in effective legislation or regulations to disincentive agents of the Chinese regime from harassment and menacing of citizens, Canadian citizens, or persons of Chinese citizenship who are resident in Canada and therefore still protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or Huawei 5G, or which Canada has not banned. Or any number of other things, including Magnitsky sanctions, providing safe harbor to persons in Hong Kong who would be subject to political persecution under the new national security law. Is it possible that countries like Canada that appear to be reluctant to engage in these kinds of measures against China in our asymmetrical relationship because there's concern that it would impact on Canada's promotion of prosperity through more trade and investment with China. Do you think that if we were able to get together with a common group, a D10 or something led by the United States, that Canada would then feel emboldened to engage in these many important points that you raised in your presentation? And if so, if that's possible, how would this work? Is it likely that Canada would give up sovereignty to a multilateral institution that would require that Canada change its domestic policies towards China and other countries that are engaged in such gross violations of the international rules-based order?
Well, number one, I think what Beijing has been able to successfully do is to leverage itself as an economic superpower to target and bully countries one by one, whether it be Australia or Canada or Japan and the like. That's why I felt that the founding of IPAC was a game changer because it began to revert the asymmetrical relationship, certainly on a parliamentary level, but I think more importantly would be an intergovernmental alliance, an alliance of the community of democracies. That was not possible under Trump's leadership because it was going the other way, as has been described earlier. But I do believe that the Biden administration has announced that it wants to have a summit on democracy, that it wants to bring together the community of democracies. We are already engaged in that regard, let's say in the community of democracies, if you will, regarding justice for Sergei Magnitsky sanctions. And there's no reason why that shouldn't be broadened and have a comprehensive multilateral set of initiatives by the community of democracies, and that would reverse the asymmetrical relationship that would dramatically increase the economic leverage of the community of democracies. It would counter the bullying of Beijing, and I believe that could be a game changer. I think IPAC was the beginning of a parliamentary game changer. I think a community of democracies on a multilateral level would be a game changer internationally, and Canada could feel more secure in being part of the necessary initiatives that can be taken so that China couldn't bully it as it has done with its hostage diplomacy with the two Michaels, but we would reverse the situation and be holding Beijing accountable.
Yes, I quite agree. Canada is inclined to want to be part of multilateral organizations, not excluded. So I do hold out some hope for this under a new U.S. administration. Now we turn to closing remarks, and I'd invite Marika Olberg to say a few final words.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, a lot has been said. A lot of concrete proposals are in the making. If we can push them all through, it'll be hard work, but I am cautiously optimistic that we are slowly but steadily making headway on all of this. One thing that hasn't come up as much, but that I want to raise in my final remarks, is to really use the public more, to raise awareness among the public more of these issues, to make sure that Chinese human rights and
live streaming is on.
To make sure that Chinese human rights does not stay an issue that is only discussed among the groups that are actually affected by them the most, that it does not is not the issue of a few people only, but that there is broad public awareness, and that this will be able to raise pressure on governments, on parliaments, and to make sure that there is plenty of public support to pass good action that lead to good China policy, and also to prevent the kind of action that takes us back. So we should not underestimate the role of the public in this, and should keep working to raise awareness in all of our societies for this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kinnock.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been such a fascinating discussion. I think in terms of our strategy, we know that we have to be tough and robust, and we have to confront China on the issues of human rights and the violation of the rule of law. For example, what's happening with Hong Kong and the undermining of the Sino-British Declaration. We know we also have to compete with China. We know that they are not long from now will become the world's largest economy. It's a technology powerhouse. In order for us to be able to confront more effectively, we have to be able to compete more effectively, because so many economies and governments around the world are compromised by their over-reliance economically on China. And we've also seen the vital role that the Belt and Road Initiative has played by China, creating a kind of debt trap diplomacy with so many countries around the world. And that has also led to a dominant position for China in the United Nations and other international arenas. So in order to be able to confront more effectively, we have to compete. We've got to reduce our economic dependence. And we also need to cooperate. It's the COP26 next year, chaired by the United Kingdom. Climate change is an existential crisis facing the planet. China is still building far more coal-fired power stations than any other place in the world. And if they don't come to the table at COP26 and agree to act effectively, there's not really much chance for dealing with climate change unless China moves with us in the right direction. So it's got to be confront, compete, and cooperate. And a final point on this issue around building international alliances. I think this idea of a D10, so the G7 plus India, Australia, and South Korea. The United Kingdom is chairing the G7 this year. It's a real opportunity for the United Kingdom to show leadership. We should create a D10, and it should specifically be about pooling our resources and investment into technology so that we can actually compete on 5G, on internet standards, and on a range of other issues. We need a grand bargain, transatlantic and with the Indo-Pacific democracies, to be able to compete more effectively, because I think that's the key to enabling us to confront more effectively and ultimately to cooperate more effectively as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And last word on this panel to Dr. Kotler. I think you're muted.
On mute.
Yeah. You're still muted. Ah, there we are.
Yeah. As we've heard, and Ben characterized it so compellingly, that the darkness has been deepening, but at the same time, we have been witnessing wake-up calls, a sounding of the alarm increasingly by parliamentarians and civil society. And this finds reflection in the dramatic changes in Canadian public opinion. One sees this in Canada, for example, over the last 5 years, the dramatic change in the increase in the mistrust of Beijing by over 80% of Canadians. So in a word, we've reached an important inflection point where governments, parliaments, civil society, international institutions know that they will not only be supported, but they will be encouraged now to take the necessary actions and not only utter the necessary words, or even that was not done, and to do all this to counter what is effectively, and I've never used these words, I've always referred to Beijing as an authoritarian state, but I think what we are increasingly seeing it as being as a totalitarian surveillance state that is repressing its citizens at home and exporting that repression abroad. And we have therefore individually and collectively an international responsibility, as I've said, to secure justice for the victims, to hold them accountable. And I hope we will witness the community of democracies coming together for that purpose on all levels.
Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful 3 panels, and I thank the speakers for their excellent insights. I see from Brett that we've had over 3,000 people tuned in live, and I'm sure there'll be many more watches on YouTube. Now, to just finish up the event, we'll have some closing remarks, and I'd like to call upon Chairman Bartholomew to give her final take on this.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you again for the invitation to participate, especially with such a distinguished group of people on this seminar. There are so many points that people have raised. It also is, I'll focus on a few, but it really strikes me. Just since last Friday, I've been asked to speak on China technology in Africa in one place at our National Defense University on China and 5G, and then in front of the government relations people for a group of our American universities who are grappling with issues, and all of these issues touch on human rights in one way or another. So I think there's a lot of outreach even within the China interested community to engage and broaden the coalition of people. I think that Xi Jinping's tactics, particularly the bullying, the economic coercion, the way the Chinese government initially responded to COVID-19 are all opportunities that we can, working together across countries, across parties. I think there are just some opportunities there. There's a lot of concern in public opinion in a number of countries around the world about what China's rise means. I will put a plug in for countries that don't have some sort of Foreign Agent Registration Act, the significance of that. And we'll just mention here in the United States, we had a former US Senator who signed up to represent the interests of the U.S. subsidiary of Hikvision, the Chinese surveillance company. The Biden administration found out about that because of the Foreign Agent Registration Act and has returned her contribution to the inaugural team. So that kind of transparency is really important in countering Chinese influence. I think what Stephen Kinnock mentioned in terms of reducing dependence on Chinese supply chains, certainly a huge issue here in the United States that people are thinking about, talking about, and wanting to do something about, and rebuilding alliances, critically important. So I'm hopeful that we get to next Wednesday with the inauguration of a new president here in the United States, and I'm hopeful that that will provide a reset. Again, the Biden administration has been quite clear that they are interested in re-engaging with U.S. partners, alliances, friends around the world, and I think that that's critically important. My final comment is, having done this now for 30 years, that the biggest barrier to action on human rights is the power of the business community, and we all need to figure out a way to counter that. One of the ways to do that, of course, is the mobilization of civilian populations, of citizens. And America mentioned that, and I would just want to emphasize that people should not presume that politicians know what you know, and you should not presume that your elected officials will automatically do what you think is the right thing. They need to hear from you in order to make what we think are the decisions that need to be made. So again, it's not I liked Stephen Kinnock's comment. It's not a right or left. It's not Democratic or Republican. These issues are a matter of right and wrong. And I think working together, we can really get some influence and some sway in terms of the decisions that are being made and how we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for participating in the event today. I was corrected by Brett with regard to the number of live viewers. We're now up to over 6,000 tuning in, so welcome all 6,000 of you. Our final speaker at this event is Benedict Rogers, who will sum it all up for us. Ben.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to pay tribute to everybody who has spoken, and I think the degree of unity and agreement, but also the diversity of interesting ideas is especially valuable. And I want to echo what's already been said about this being a right or wrong issue, not a left or right issue. I'm first and foremost a human rights activist. My own party politics is secondary, and so I really pay tribute to Stephen Kinnock and Lisa Nandy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, for what they're doing in the UK to push our government, and the similar thoughts that have been expressed from Canada and the United States and beyond. That bipartisan unity, but also that international unity, is incredibly important. I think a number of us have talked about the importance of international cooperation, the D10 or other forms of democratic alliances across the free world. And I think that's absolutely vital. And I think within that, again, you can have a unity of spirit in terms of being united in confronting this regime, but a diversity of approaches as long as they're coordinated. So some countries may take a more punitive approach. Other countries may take an approach that uses diplomatic mechanisms, perhaps mechanisms of accountability and monitoring through the United Nations. It's interesting that last year, over 50 UN special rapporteurs called for the creation of a UN rapporteur, and that's something we didn't touch on, but I think could be considered. And standing with Australia, particularly at this time, and Canada, is really important. There was a campaign last month to buy Australian wine throughout the month of December, which I strongly supported, and I think we should do the same, whether you're wine drinkers or not, in that spirit. The very last thing I just want to end on, because this hasn't been said, and I think it's important to say, and I'm sure everyone would share this view, is that it's really important that we're clear that we are critical of and anti the Chinese Communist Party regime's repression, but we are not anti-China or the Chinese people. In fact, on the contrary, I've spent most of my adult life, as have many on this panel, in and around China. I have many Chinese friends. I lived in Hong Kong. I first went to China when I was 18 years old. And it is precisely because I'm pro-China, I love the people of China, and the culture. And I want China as a great and ancient civilization to succeed, that I want the people of China to have the human rights that we in our countries take for granted, and that they for too long have been denied, but that they deserve.
Thank you very much, Ben. And we're drawing this event to a conclusion now. And I think that all of us agree that the people of China have an entitlement to the human rights as defined by the United Nations on the basis that they are human. And that certainly our event is to support people in China who are suffering under a repressive and arbitrary regime. I think that the main message that we relay here is that we can no longer give tacit consent to the kinds of activities that the Chinese regime has been engaged in domestically and internationally that are so in violation of the universal norms of the international rules-based order in diplomacy and trade. And therefore, it's incumbent on us to speak out. And I could not more amplify what Chairman Bartholomew said, which is that it's important for all of us who are concerned about our government's collaboration with China for economic purposes to make it clear to our elected officials that China matters to us and that it will impact on our electoral choices. Finally, I'd like to thank once again Optimum Publishing International, Hong Kong Watch, the China Democracy Foundation, the International Parliamentary Alliance on China, the European Values for Security Policy, and of course, most of all, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for sponsoring this event. We are anticipating having a Way Forward panel part 3 sometime in May, and I look forward to engaging with you all at the next one. And from that, I say goodbye from Canada and thank you for participating.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.